Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the ASITI Festival of Space, the Australian space industry, technology, infrastructure and investment. My name is Chris Covage. I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media, and I'll be your moderator today. And today we're going to be looking at national space capabilities. As part of the festival, we have over 40 speakers from 4 different countries and 17 plus sessions. But before we start, I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you also to our sponsors. Our platinum sponsor is Inmarsat. Our gold sponsor is Fugro Spark. We had a Women in Space session back in October as part of Global Space Week. And thank you to Lockheed Martin Australia for sponsoring that session. And our official media channel for the ASITI Festival of Space is our spaceanddefence.io channel as well. So please check that out for industry news and updates. And thank you also to our ASITI Festival of Speakers. We have over 40 speakers, as I mentioned, and thank you to all of them. So you can just get a sense of the body of knowledge that we plan to be presenting here throughout the next 4 weeks in each of these sessions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel for today. Todd McDonell, who is the President Global Government with Inmarsat, Dr. Malcolm Davis, a Strategic Analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Andy Koronios, the CEO of SmartSat CRC, Dr. Catherine Grace, Assistant Director with the South Australian Space Industry Centre. And as I mentioned, I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media, and I'll be moderating this particular session. So buckle in and enjoy the National Space Capabilities session. The broad discussion of what we wanted to take a look at was the national space capabilities. But I think before we start is the why of national space capabilities, and then also the sort of the sit-rep, the current situation that we're looking at in terms of building the national space capabilities, because it's still quite early in the piece. So maybe go to the why that we need to be looking at national space capability.
Well, thanks, Chris. Look, I think we're in an exciting time in Australian space and the growth of our space sector. You know, I recall when I first joined ASPI in 2016 as a senior analyst, and I told them that I wanted to focus on space security and space policy, and they said, please do. I began talking to key people in the then space sector, including in defense. And the mindset was very much, well, we don't even need to think about that because the Americans give us everything. That was in 2016. When you look at it now in 2021, the mindset has changed fundamentally. We're no longer content just to be passively dependent on the Americans or others to provide space capabilities for us. We recognize the potential value of a global space sector and being part of that, and doing more than just providing a suitable piece of real estate for the ground segment. We recognize that space is becoming cheaper and easier to access due to Space 2.0, the potential for the commercial space sector to lead and innovate using new technologies such as small satellites, fractionated constellations of CubeSats, and reusable rocket launch technology. And so it's becoming cheaper and easier for Australia to access space. So we have this window of opportunity now. And when the Australian Space Agency was established in 2018, that was a huge step forward from where we'd been. And so I think space in Australia has seriously taken off since then. Also in defense, I think the mindset has changed. You now see a recognition that space is not a peaceful sanctuary that's untouched by geopolitical rivalries below, but is in fact a contested operational domain that could easily become a warfighting domain. So we have to start thinking about how we ensure space access and space control and deter threats from adversaries like China and Russia that are developing counter space capabilities. So we've had a number of mindset changes which are really important. We've got a rapidly growing space sector going forward. And I think the opportunities are there in the next few years for Australia to get some significant developments in the form of satellite manufacture, the ability to launch Australian satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites on a regular and responsive basis. So building up that sovereign launch capability is really critical. And strengthening our ability to do space with key allies through agreements such as AUKUS and also with the Quad is a vital step forward. So in my opinion, where we are now is we're in a much more positive place than where we were some years back. We have a vibrant and growing space sector that I think will only get better and better and stronger. We have a government that's very supportive of the space sector. We have a Department of Defense that recognizes the importance of space and is building up our capabilities for space. And the future looking forward is very positive, particularly as we move from a Space 2.0 approach, which is commercial space, to a Space 3.0 approach, which is investment and building up space-based infrastructure that can enable a space-based economy that generates prosperity on Earth. And that will enable us to do so much more in broader aspects of space exploration, such as the Moon to Mars initiative, returning humans to the moon in this decade and going on to Mars and doing other things. So overall, I'm pretty positive about where we're headed. I think we're in a strong place. And, it's an exciting time from my perspective to be a space policy analyst.
And just finally, you mentioned it was an AUKUS moment. Maybe if you want to expand just a little bit more on where we're going to sit with AUKUS and why that is so significant.
Look, AUKUS is a massive transformation in our thinking on defence, not just because we are looking now to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, but because of the doors and the windows that it opens with the US and the UK in other areas. When the AUKUS agreement was announced, space wasn't part of that agreement. And everyone kind of scratched their heads, I think, and said space has to be there. I think there's now a recognition after the fact that space is really critical. And so opportunities within AUKUS and through AUKUS for Australia to work with the US and the UK on space capabilities is very clear. And the potential for us to work with the Americans on new types of satellite technology, new launch capabilities for rapid and responsive space launch to reconstitute lost capabilities in the event of a counter space threat, the ability to strengthen our space domain awareness capabilities both from the Earth and in space, I think is all there. And so we have a number of projects that are starting to emerge, new types of capabilities and new types of missions in space, the potential for the Australian commercial space sector to play a key role in that beyond those current major projects such as DEF 799 Phase 2 and JP 9102B, to build up new types of capabilities that can be pursued through AUKUS. So there is an AUKUS moment, there is a window of opportunity, a momentum that we should exploit to open new doors and windows towards greater space collaboration that might then open up all sorts of potential opportunities for reshaping Australia's defence approach to space.
And thank you. And for the audience, my apologies, I didn't press record at the start, so that's why you have to come to the live webinar sessions. And Malcolm, I didn't want to interrupt you either, but I think you've touched on very nicely in terms of the national capability requirements and the why. And as you say, it's an AUKUS moment. Catherine, you're there in South Australia with the Space Industry Centre. The perspectives that sort of as Malcolm introduced there on the national defence requirements as well, how does that sit with you, and where do you think Australia should be focusing and is focusing on at the moment?
First of all, Malcolm really touched on all the important points of what Australia really does need to be focusing on. And I agree, the Space 2.0, Space 3.0, or new space, really this high-tech equipment manufacturing startup sector, the fact that we're getting commercialization and players outside of government really allows Australia to be in the forefront of where we need to be focusing. Absolutely agree that launch is a capability that we need to be focusing on, and it's something that South Australia has done as a priority. We know that the geography of South Australia or Australia is really well suited to increase this ground-based infrastructure. That's including launch sites, ground station, mission constellations, but also we're really well positioned within Australia and again, South Australia for the critical SSA or space domain awareness and debris monitoring. So any collisions, anything that in this contested environment, whether it be by nefarious means or not, really a collision in especially low Earth orbit can completely disrupt both our civil space, but also our defense capabilities within the area. So this position is ideal for locating, for tracking, for the management of the activity. So it's a really critical area of interest for defense, but also for our civil space strategy. And we touched on policy. And one thing that is really critical to all of this is getting that right. So we know that Australia's cost recovery model that's proposed for certification of launch for launch vehicles, particularly for small sats, it's actually less competitive than in comparison to other nations. And what that does is actually drives this upstream space industry offshore, which really puts us in a difficult position. We're not able to build our national capability if we have to go offshore, which is why not only launch is critical, but also getting the policy piece right.
And from that perspective, for Andy, you're also in South Australia and Lot 14 and the CRC model that you operate as well. And from the policy, where do you find that sits with you and how that gives you your charter with the SmartSat CRC and being driven by national policy?
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the previous speakers for setting the scene so well for us this morning. From our perspective, first of all, we are a cooperative research centre. We are funded by the federal government, but also our partners. We have more than 100 partners in total, and that actually represents a significant portion of the space industry, at least the producers of R&D and innovation in this area. We have managed to secure $250 million in R&D, but we're actually moving in two areas. First of all, the new generation of technologies, but also building and lifting the capability here in Australia. I think the civil space strategy provides a great guide for us to prioritize and to focus. We believe very strongly that if you try to do everything, you probably achieve nothing. And therefore, what we've done together with our partners is we've focused in three major areas for our technologies. We focus very much on next generation communications because we feel that that represents a significant opportunity for Australia. It is one of the big priorities of the National Space Civil Strategy. And in that, we're looking at new generation of IoT, optical communications, hybrid and compact RF and optical communication terminals. We look at how might we intelligently manage spectrum for the future, and of course, quantum communications, particularly quantum communications for security. The other thing we believe in is that we are now in the world, we are really entering the golden age of remote sensing. So we are focusing our research on new and powerful sensors for EO and remote sensing, the smart analytics to make sense of the big data, increasingly big data, because the resolutions are increasing, they're getting better, but also the number of satellites are increasing as well. And finally, we're looking at analytics on the edge, analytics on the platform itself. And we want to make the satellites far more intelligent. We want them to be autonomous, to really become intelligent, sentient platforms, if you like, that can work in constellations to achieve objectives. I think Malcolm mentioned about our ability to build and manufacture and launch very large satellites. It'll be a nice objective, it'll be a nice vision, but at this particular moment, it is probably a bridge too far for Australia. but then the layer of smaller satellites, not only just the CubeSats, up to 50 kg, but actually a little bit bigger than that to be able to put better sensors on board. So we believe that Australia is able to achieve that, and Australia should have a vision to be able to actually also not just launch and manufacture the satellites, which I believe eventually will become commodities, but also put the smarts on those satellites to do some really good applications for us. And of course, we must not forget, and certainly at SmartSat, we are not forgetting that Australia and the industry will grow. But in order to do that, we also need to feed the pipeline of capability. So we have a strong agenda of actually identifying the skills. In fact, we've done a piece of work with the Space Agency on the skill gap analysis that is now a public document. We have funded 73 PhD scholarships, and they provide significant flow and effects for the economy, for R&D and for industry innovation. And we have also funded 9 professorial chairs in our partner universities to build the capability around focused areas like optical communications, like cybersecurity and AI.
Thank you, Andy. And we'll definitely come back to the skills requirements as well in that gap analysis, I think, and then maybe the projections of time, because obviously you don't just switch these skills on, you have to develop them over time, which then comes back to the strategy and the policy of where we're heading to. And Todd, from Inmarsat, the focus from you as a sort of satellite company as well, your position also dealing with governments around the world, how do you see Australia at the moment sitting within sort of that global ecosystem of space, where space is at the moment, and the observations that you've got with the Australian policy direction and setting?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I appreciate what people already said. I guess we do take a slightly different view about these things. So first of all, space is an international business. You can't do space and not think internationally, whereas you might want to make some sort of indigenous capability in some areas. Just the very nature of space means it's international straight off that. So I think it's important we think about what the international opportunity is, and then what the Australian build into that is. And I tend to think of this as a crawl, walk, run piece. So I hear ideas about policy and more government funding and so on. In fact, our observation is that if you can show an organisation, say Australia, look, we need that piece that you've got, that's great, that gets sucked into our supply chain, that becomes an international opportunity for that company, and then that builds the base of that company becomes more capable because we've sucked that into our supply chain, done some stuff offshore, and that will build the onshore capability. So policy is important, but there's got to be a parallel track about how we generate opportunity for technology and business here that we can use offshore. And today we have, I don't know, about 3 or 4 companies now that we're working with. There's some well-known names, Clearbox and EM Solutions, for example. They either build technology for us or we use their technology for our customers. But without giving some names, we have a couple of other Australian companies we're working with now who are very well-known Australian companies, but not in the space game. And we are pulling their technology into our space technology. Now, that will deliver new skills for those companies because they don't normally work in space. It gives us some new capability. And we often go back to government and say, well, look, this is working. So maybe you want to think in your policy, how do we enhance these kinds of economic cycles? Because it is a big turn of the wheel for these things. You can't just throw a small amount of money at this sort of stuff to get into the international space game. Today, launch, for us, big scale launch is still a $40 or $50 million enterprise. So if you want to get into that kind of scale of business, which the space strategy talks about, 20,000 jobs, 12 billion per annum business, we have to plug into that scale of business. And if we want to do that in a reasonably timely fashion, we can't do little things. We've got to find some big things to do.
Malcolm, maybe back to you, because I think when you introduced in terms of the AUKUS moment and our partnerships, our key strategic partnerships looking at national space capability, I think with Andy, Catherine and Todd brings it down to more the civil side of the business. How does that fit with you in terms of, because even if we looked at AUKUS and the submarine deal, we're looking at 2050 periods of time. is that also a problem, do you think, in terms of where Australia is in this? Because even the strategy itself for Australia was 2019, so we're still very early days into what is a 10-year strategy. How do you think about timelines in this respect? And I like Todd's sort of analogy of crawl, walk, and then run. Are we still crawling?
I think we're somewhere between crawling and walking.
Okay.
I'm a glass half full type of person, always. But in comparison with the subs, space is moving a lot faster than the subs. The subs are going to be a 2030s, 40s, 50s type capability, which is a real problem in itself. But space is something that can happen very fast. If you look at the speed of which Space 2.0 has taken off from the 1990s onwards to where we are now, where you have big companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and various different others coming along. And Blue Origin just the other week talked about the orbital reef, commercial space platform. These are ideas that are happening very quickly. Now, the implementation and the execution of those ideas has to happen. It's not just a case of putting up some fancy video online and saying this is what we're going to do. But the conceptual development and the thinking and the debate is occurring a lot faster. So I think Australia is well positioned to be able to adopt an approach of fortune favors the bold, and essentially, let's actually do something really amazing and actually try for something ambitious. It's okay from a commercial perspective to crawl, walk, run. I agree with that, but we've got to have some big goals. So let me bring in the idea of a national space strategy, which I think we're lacking. The 2019 Australian Space Agency Civil Space Strategy is a great document. I've used it extensively in all my work. It's a document which basically is about growing the commercial sector, more so than necessarily building up a national space policy or a national space capability. Defence is currently undergoing a space domain review, and that'll be finalised next year. But the average person in the street won't have access to that because it'll be a highly classified document. So how is the average Australian meant to understand what it is we are trying to achieve as a country in space if we don't have a national space strategy? So one of the things I would strongly suggest any incoming government after the next election to look at is writing a national space strategy that brings together civil, commercial, and defence in one document that provides high-level overall guidance at a strategic level on what is Australia trying to achieve in space over a specified time frame, and it could be out to 2030, and then allocate the resources to achieve those goals. It's not just about growing jobs and growing the sector. It's about what it is we are trying to achieve as a country in space. It's space grand strategy, and we don't have that at the moment.
Obviously, that would plug into a national resilience strategy or a national national strategy, because space is just one of the many domains. I like the way Andy's already mentioned cybersecurity is one, and sort of in our pre-discussions, we have almost competing sectors in advanced technology, critical technology, but space is very broad, as the sort of national civil space priority areas are. There's 8 of them. Catherine, space and defence, can they be separated? Does that line consistently move, do you find, in the space industry, or do you find it is quite a unique industry on its own? It considers itself standalone, and defence has a small part of space, or do you find the two converge quite strongly here in Australia?
Great question. And I think the panel will agree with me and say that this is something that has definitely recently changed on how it used to be perceived. Defense and space used to be sort of this one element, but we've seen now both the civil and commercial space sector grow and change. We have to all agree that defense and space, and of course cyber, are intimately involved in one another, because space is, we've got communication and technology services, SSA, PNT, robotics, as Andy was mentioning, what we're expecting to do with space-enabled services. That's that data and mining. So we've got mining services, we've got crops, bushfire tracking, detection. So there's definitely this civil component. And while certain aspects can be separated and there is growth, I think the sector, as it matures, will be able to separate from defense more strongly. But for now, there is this tie, especially when we speak about our geopolitical position, what we want to achieve with the Quad Plus, where Australia envisages itself in the sector, not just space, but in actually the region where we want to see ourselves as leader. So there is definitely this incredibly strong link to defense with space. We note that here in South Australia, we're one of the leading defense states, but there's this transition and this change to new space, to this high tech. We've seen what's happening in the States with these big players, with the commercialization, and it would be to our disadvantage to not recognize the opportunities that are happening with this new sector.
And Andy, same question to you as well. How do you separate that defence? Because you are, once you start to deal with that, sort of the analytics and some of the advanced technologies that you create, it's hard for probably defence not to be knocking on the door. Or do you also find on the flip side to that, we might come back to Malcolm on this question of, is the civil space sector growing so fast that it is almost leaving defence behind? And the global opportunities that it creates, it becomes more important than our national security perspectives. And maybe one step further of, is there any particular areas that you find is problematic in terms of space and defence and that advanced technologies that you're working on in terms of the research?
Thank you. From my perspective, there is, as Catherine and Malcolm indeed, by calling for a national space strategy, there is a strong nexus between the two and a strong interest between the two. In fact, they are intertwined in my view. First of all, SmartSat is not only civil R&D. We are also doing, we're working very strongly, very well with DST in particular, but with defense in general. Defense is a big investor in SmartSat. And indeed, only last week, we did a bit of an analysis of, we already have launched, we're only 2 years old, but we've launched about 90 R&D projects. And we've counted that 48 of those projects, defense was either leading, participating, or had a strong interest in the type of activities that we were involved in. And I would hazard to say that, in fact, when they saw the outputs of the rest of the R&D, they would have an interest in that as well. Clearly, of course, defense has a classified domain. Defense will be doing things that we don't know about, but they are very, very keen on not only exploiting the R&D outputs from the civil side, but also building that area, building that industrial capability that will then serve defense in the future. At the moment, as Malcolm said in the beginning, pretty much most of the procurement is done overseas. And you can see why. It's reasonable to actually see that, but we want to come to a position where we are in fact able, through our innovation and our capability, we're able to fill in some of those capabilities, not all of them. Todd is absolutely right that space is an international, a global activity, but Australia can add to that. And certainly our defense can benefit from all of the work that we're doing. So I do believe that the two are very, very closely linked. You know, a lot of people use the term dual use and so on, but it is in fact a lot of the activities that we are doing are of interest and of critical importance to defense, and vice versa. Some of the work from defense actually ends up in civil, for civil applications, productized and commercialized, if defense wants that to happen.
And Todd, I think maybe to highlight this aspect is the Geoscience Project Positioning Australia program. Can you maybe highlight the importance, and maybe you looking at GPS as an example of what advancements have been made there, and that might sort of wrap that aspect up of why this is so important and critical around, say, positioning, timing, and the like, and some of the work that Inmarsat is doing?
I'll I'd like to actually come at it from 3 different ways. Thanks, Chris. So first of all, that question about pace of innovation. So JP 9102 for the Australian Defence Force is designed to give them new sovereign space capability. It's replacing Optus C1D, more than 15 years old. So we're going to put some new technology on orbit to look after the ADF, 15 years old. We will launch 7 new spacecraft in the next 3 years. We have 7 high tech, in fact, 2 due for launch right now, the highest tech built so far. So we're going to do 7 spacecraft in 3 years. ADF's replacing 1 spacecraft after some like 17 or 18 years of use. And the program to do that still got about 3 or 4 years to run to get started. So just in terms of pace of innovation, that's a very big difference. Secondly, Andy made a very good point. So dual use is becoming so much more common. In another life, a long time ago, I had to worry about how to put SATCOM on submarines, and that was quite a trying task. But nowadays, we pick up commercial tech and reposition it as military tech, and we pick up military tech and recommission it as reposition as commercial tech. And we're flying spacecraft today that in fact have one side of them that looks commercial and the other side that looks military. And the military now start to understand that actually I don't just need to buy military stuff and commercial stuff. I want to mix and match. And in fact, if you're working on the battlefield, if you're in a contested domain, sometimes you want to look like the other guy, sometimes you want to look like the civilian person, and sometimes you want to look like the military person. So all of that is you want that to be grey now. That's no longer one thing or the other. Now, the geoscience program is great, right? So that is all about how to make positioning more accurate. In fact, it's more accurate, more secure. So the geoscience program, SBAS, transmits an L-band signal, so a signal that's very similar to a normal GPS signal. So similar, in fact, that a normal aircraft GPS receiver can receive it. So if you can imagine, it takes a lot to fit something to a plane, and so you don't want to have to change things. So if you can produce a signal that helps a plane that you don't have to modify the plane for, that's a massive improvement. And what the SBAS program does is give this extra signal to the aircraft GPS receiver and dramatically change the position accuracy. So we're talking from normal 20, 25 meters down to, my understanding is 5 centimeters. Some of the documents I've seen say 10 centimeters, let's say a lot more accurate. And that has both civil and military benefits. So for a civilian pilot, if you're trying to get into a small strip in the middle of Australia, a big place, being out a little bit means you miss the strip and you can't afford to do that because you'll run out of fuel. For the military pilots, that means you get a more secure positioning signal so that you can use that to make sure you're on target, if you like. The spin out of that is agriculture, precision agriculture, making sure a tractor does not keep running over the plants, but instead seed them, transport as well. So there's a great example where you absolutely are seeing a military and civilian benefit, and they're kind of combined together. They're not separate.
Yeah, Malcolm, you're a defence strategist, an analyst as well as a space analyst. How do you combine the two? Because again, as this dual use approach, and Todd just mentioned the grey area, which is beautiful from a security perspective or a defence perspective. You can go grey, your friend or foe, are you civil or military? Again, in a sort of a wargaming perspective, that's extremely beneficial and powerful, particularly also we're getting down to the centimetres of accuracy, but then also the criticality of that positioning becomes important too. That becomes almost a point of failure as well if that's taken down. How do you find, or maybe some of the work that ASITII is doing, to combine like the multi-skill level required in the work that you're now doing from a sort of a defence strategy, and then looking at what is happening in space and the new capabilities coming through, and then the uplift of national capabilities here as well? Do you think it just requires a whole new way of thinking in terms of wargaming and traditional national security and national defence?
Look, I think that the dual use aspect of space has been around for a while. I mean, where defence forces have used commercial satellites and increasingly commercial satellites can support defence. So that's not new, but I think that you are seeing an increasing challenge here in the sense of the grey zone in orbit, where an adversary can utilise commercial capabilities to threaten our military space capabilities. There's an excellent report out by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC called Defense Against the Dark Arts in Space, which looks at the gray zone in orbit and essentially examines how an adversary could use commercial capabilities as a mask for counter space operations and anti-satellite attacks. And so how do you determine if a satellite goes down, did it just fail? Was it a technical failure, or was it somehow interfered with by another satellite? Then, these are the sorts of questions we're going to be facing going forward. And as our use and exploitation of space broadens, particularly as we get into a future where we've got mega constellations of thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, providing all sorts of services, wherever it's Internet of Things or broadband in the sky or pervasive Earth observation and all sorts of other industries. How do we protect those critical foundations, and how do we use those foundations? How do we use thousands of small satellites in LEO to our benefit in terms of, say, ADF operations? So there's all sorts of opportunities here for Australia to think about the next step in utilizing space. It's not just about large satellites in GEO anymore. Those are important. Those are always going to be there. But that LEO market of small satellites, I think, is really critical. And that's where Australia is well positioned to participate in. That's where we're good at. We can develop small satellites. We can develop fractionated constellations of CubeSats. And we can develop the launch capabilities to put them up there rather than relying on others. And that, I think, is crucial. So that, to me, is where I would be focusing on, and recognize that it's going to be a while before maybe we can put up a large bird in GEO. And I think that the other thing that we need to think about is the Americans are already thinking about, how do we use satellites and do military operations in cislunar space? We need to jump on board that bandwagon as well. We're already supporting the Moon to Mars initiative in support of Artemis, but there's a military dimension to that as well, which is starting to emerge. It's going to become more and more important later this decade that we need to be thinking about right now.
I'll plan to see, we are on Wednesday, we're looking at AI and robotics in space as well. So we'll touch off on that. And I know we're sort of going there. The cybersecurity realm and the legislation on critical infrastructure comes to mind when I asked that previous question. And Todd, from your perspective, we might just touch on legislation. We touched on policy at the start, but where the legislative framework here in Australia, have you noticed any gaps, or how you deal with sort of countries around the world and their government structures? Australia still has some work to do around the legislative frameworks for space.
Sorry, Chris, just legislative frameworks for space or cyber? You started talking about cyber.
No,
specifically
to draw a parallel, we're seeing cybersecurity being applied to critical infrastructure sectors because it's a national security issue. The legislative framework that you're observing here in Australia compared to, say, countries elsewhere, do you think we've got the right legislative framework here for space, or do you find there's still quite a bit of work to do?
It's, I think Malcolm's talked about this before, it's very broad. So to his very good point about a sort of a complete space strategy, it does not really address very many specific things. So there's still important areas around spectrum planning, orbital allocation and so on. They're pretty standard for the way many countries do it. So it's not really geared around a sovereign industry, for example. If I showed you what the legislative platform looks like in the United States, because they have such a massive sovereign space industry, it is much more geared to that. And there's a lot of interesting debate. Starlink recently talked about they want to reduce their orbit. That was a very normal conversation with the FCC. If you want to do that in Australia, that's not a normal conversation, because that's not the sort of thing we normally deal with. So, but I think that's just like any industry, right? If the industry is not very mature, then the rest of things, government legislation is not very mature either. So bit to my crawl, walk, run piece, you build these things up. And certainly I appreciate Malcolm's point about, you need policy and strategy. My experience has been, it's a bit, I think Tom Cruise once said, show me the money. So it's very easy to work with government. You say, I can show you where this can get to. This is probably where we need to go to get there. And that often then drives a greater interest in a policy agenda and strategic plans and so on. So sometimes it's hard to get that understanding of what's possible until you show them the opportunity, and then you can draw the journey. And of course, in government, there's so many competing priorities. So it's important to kind of give them a view of what's possible to get on that journey.
and the vision. Andy, and there's a couple of questions from the audience, and welcome questions from the audience, and we should be able to get to them depending on how many are, but we've definitely got a couple. Andy and Catherine, I wanted to maybe just finish off on the skill gap analysis. Andy, how did that skill gap analysis look? Was it challenging for us, and the outlook for those skills? If we look at those sort of 8 priority areas, we seem to be doing quite well in robotics and that type of technology. Cybersecurity we're not too bad in, and a few of the others around the analytics, but the skills required, how's Australia looking in terms of building that national capability and that pipeline of skills? Just on mute.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the skill gaps analysis, even though we have completed the first phase, is an unfinished project. We now have actually signed, again, together with the Space Agency, we're working on phase 2 of that. And in fact, there is a phase 3 coming up as well. The first phase identified and mapped what new skills and existing skills does the new space industry require. And we identified, I think it was 311 competencies that are required. We found that Australia has quite good competencies in a number of areas, in the software, in the analytics, in robotics, and remote operations. There are areas of gap and systems integration, putting things in systems rather than just individual skills and technologies, putting them together. That was something that we identified as an issue. But that work, the second phase is now drilling down to really identify and come up with some strategies of what would be the next step with those. And the third one would be to actually match what are the skills that we have and what are the skills that are offered through our university programs, TAFE, industry indeed, industry training and so on. And then at the end of the day, then design new curricula for us to build that capability and the workforce for space.
And Catherine, your perspective at the Space Industry Centre there in Adelaide, which is arguably Australia's kind of focus in terms of the space industry, is quite competitive, getting competitive between the states, but speaking on behalf of industry maybe?
Well, I'll touch on sort of 2 points here. One is, as I said before, as the space industry grows, it's really incumbent on each state and territory to work together to sort of optimize the scarce resources that are available, not only commercially, but also in the skills gap. So without this, we'll have this unfettered competition, and that can destroy the industry in its infancy. And that also goes on to the skills gap. SmartSat CRC has done a brilliant job recognizing that we need certain educational offerings, that there's this pipeline problem. But what we can't have is this really limited pool of resources, which we've seen happen, where certain skills and trades are just taken from one to another. So for example, we've got the submarine program, which takes from the mining industry, which takes from the cyber industry, and all our really high skilled people are just being either bought and taken overseas, or it goes to the highest bidder. And then there's this real lack of any sovereign capability. We know that a goal is a goal here for SASIC is definitely to develop this comprehensive space education program that's going to lead to a sizable but also interdisciplinary workforce. So you need the depth of education to be able to support space, but also realize that these skills are translatable across industry. So yes, defense, yes, mining, agriculture. So that's that critical piece. And from the industry perspective, that's what we need. You need the people. And if you're always competing and out-competing, we have to either bring in from overseas or export overseas, which really are skills and talent. So this developing highly skilled and diverse workforce is going to be essential, but also to have it sustainable. So if we don't have a national plan and a national growth strategy to support the education, if it's coming in waves and troughs, you're not going to have, you're just not going to have the people there
consistency.
who want to stay.
Well, the other
Absolutely.
thing, and Todd, I was going to raise to you is that a risk or a high risk factor that Australia needs to be aware of? You mentioned space as an international business, so if we start to grow certain capabilities, it could easily be sort of bought and those skills taken offshore. We can spend a lot of time educating and upskilling, but there will be a degree of loss of those skills, will there not, in an international space sector?
So, yes, a good point, Chris. Look, it's a competitive global market for skills. In fact, in any industry, that's not just a space industry thing. But it's an interesting trade-off. Catherine touched a little bit on this already. So, you know, Australia is quite an attractive place. So you do get this other benefit. See, some of the startups already in Australia who came from overseas to be here. So in fact, I recognise absolutely skills is a tough thing. We face that as well. We have the benefit of being international, so we look for skills in multiple places and move those around. So we offer that as a bit of a benefit. But I also think that Australia's natural attractiveness means that we can actually bring people in. And we certainly look for opportunities to do that. And in fact, one or two conversations running right now with particular companies are looking at how components of their businesses which are not onshore could be brought onshore. So I think there's some other ways, some other things to be leveraged. I agree that we do tend to move some important skills pools around between the different industries. That is a classic benefit thing as well, because when you bring people from a different industry, they bring new ideas as well. If you want innovation, you want new ideas. So you want a bit of that, but I recognise it's no good if you left a hole where you just pull people out of. But the international thing, I think, has benefit as much as it has risk.
Yeah, and I want to get to the question. We've got still 10. We still want to finish at the top of the hour. Let's go to some questions. One thing we haven't discussed is regional capabilities and regional partnerships that we might bring in some of this. Would the ASA in defence support a human launch capability in Australia in the future? Not too sure if that's going to be in the short term. We might leave that one. Malcolm, any mindset on that? Do you think human launch capability?
Look, I think one thing we could do is stand up a cadre of astronauts to participate in international missions.
Well, we just had a Melbourne astronaut go up as a tourist, but
yeah, but I'm talking about proper astronauts. Okay?
Yeah, got it.
What I'm saying is, let's actually build up a cadre of astronauts that can participate in Project Artemis, so that one day Australians can sit and watch an Australian astronaut standing on the lunar surface with an Australian flag on their spaceship, not an American flag. Because I think it's absolutely wrong that Australians must change their citizenship to go into space.
Yes, and we've had a couple of examples, yeah.
Let's build up a cadre of astronauts, of really top people that can participate in these international missions that are going to be happening, going to the moon, going to Mars, going to commercial orbital platforms and so forth, before we think about a human launch capability here in Australia. I think that human launch capability is a fair way off. I know Gilmore is talking about a launch vehicle that could do that, but I think let's in this case walk before we run and actually develop that astronaut corps first that are participating in international missions. And that to me would be, you know, one of the most inspiring things. If you want to talk about the next generation of space leaders and young people doing STEM, seeing an Australian standing on the lunar surface sometime this decade would be a very inspiring act for this country. And I think that's what we could aim for.
I think that's where the debate in a national strategy would come in, is that where we want to go and what's more important? For Todd, I'm not too sure if you can answer this one. Can you tell how the space strategy aligns with the quantum assured position navigation Starshot at the DSTG? Are there plans for collaborations and funding? We will be hearing from Starshot during the festival, but any thoughts on that, on the quantum assured position navigation?
So I'm aware of Starshot. I couldn't say I'm an expert in quantum assured positioning, no.
Okay.
But I would say in terms of serious market opportunity that I think Australia could participate in much more, PNT is a global problem and opportunity. So, I mean, no doubt DSCG given their normal work, would be doing that from a defence point of view. But because the world of autonomous things has to know the centimetre accuracy where it is, that PNT resilience that's got far more opportunity. I think that's the largest and closest market opportunity in terms of space. That's an area we could do very well out of.
Okay, and we do have we've got a listener from Indonesia. Maybe let's touch off on regional capability building as well with partners. Andy, your partner, as a CRC, do you deal internationally or regionally with partners in research?
Yes, we do. To Todd's point of space being a global enterprise, we have actually very early in our formation of the CRC engaged with international partners. We went to partners, particularly in the US and Europe in the first instance. We have very strong relationships with NASA, for instance. Indeed, we have 3 projects with NASA, and one of those projects is on search and rescue, the new generation of search and rescue capabilities. Another one is actually on precision timing and quantum clocks, because as Malcolm said, GPS, first of all, GPS can be compromised, and you could actually end up with a GPS or whatever the GNSS PNT kind of capabilities. It could be compromised anyway, but also when you move outside Earth, then you need to be able to have some type of navigational capability. And the work that we are doing in photonics and high precision clocks, particularly for very small swap, is world leading. And we're working with one of our partners, Quantex, to actually progress that capability, and defense is very, very interested in that.
I like it.
Sorry, Chris, I'll just chime in there, but we spoke about this earlier. You know, Australia has been participating internationally with space since the very beginning. 50 years since our first rocket launch anniversary. Good. Just this past weekend. That's not something we did on our own. It was truly an international effort. UK was involved, Germans involved, you know, the whole system. And that's really true now. Not only are we really involved in the UK space bridge, as a state employee, I know that here with South Australia's government, we've invested about nearly 13 million in overseas offices. So in Malaysia, in India, Singapore, Thailand, Japan, to help attract that inbound investment in our capability with specifically this advanced technology in relation to space. And that is directed to projects with the CRC that Andy mentioned. So it's really definitely a global ecosystem.
And Malcolm, maybe to the Quad, do you think, again, you mentioned AUKUS and an AUKUS moment, should also be a potential Quad moment as well, because obviously Japan and India have strong space industries.
Absolutely. We shouldn't ignore Japan and India. I think they're key partners. Quad is becoming more and more important as an organization, and we have a Quad space component, which has been stood up since the last summit. So let's actually sit down with the Japanese and the Indians and actually work with them on how we can do collaborative projects in terms of space science, in terms of developing new types of launch capability. One of the things that the Chinese are developing and seem to be making headway on is reusable spaceplane technology. We should be doing the same thing. Otherwise, the chances are we'll be falling behind in that next generation type of launch capability. Rockets and capsules are fine. Everyone understands how that technology works. But if you want to have fast, responsive, low-cost access to space in the 2030s and the 40s, it's going to be spaceplane technology. And to my knowledge, I don't think the Americans are really looking at that at this point. So let's actually work on that as a project and maybe see where that takes us.
We do have a partner. I did interview someone, I can't remember the company's name, I'm sorry, in New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand capabilities, maybe I can open it up to the panel. Is there much happening between Australia and New Zealand? Because obviously New Zealand has some unique sort of positions as well, and is looking at a space industry. Is it an opportunity also for Australia and New Zealand to partner more closely?
There's always opportunities. I think that it's just a case of, do you seize them and do you create them? So obviously Rocket Labs is a US company launching out of New Zealand.
That's the ones. Thank you.
They're not, they're New Zealand people, Kiwis, but they're a US company. The New Zealand Space Agency is pretty small and very sort of like in the background. So I think there's always an opportunity for Australia and New Zealand to work together on launch capability, on satellite manufacturing, and we need to stimulate and grow that dialogue.
Well, look, what I might do, given we're just running out of time now, I might just ask for some closing comments from you, from each of you, just in terms of, so the 2022 to 2025 outlook for Australia from a national capability and sort of your expectations for the next 3 years. We're seeing rapid growth. We're in quite a very exciting period, but when we look out to, say, 2025, what are some of the key things that you expect to see, or if you were going to give advice to government or into industry, what they would be focusing on? And maybe, Catherine, from your perspective at the Industry Centre, if I could maybe start with you.
Thanks for this, Chris, and panel. This has been brilliant. I know I could keep talking for hours, and the discourse has been great. Look, the South Australian government acknowledges that Australia's interest in space, it really requires a whole of government approach. We need to have the growth of both the civil space industrial base, but also really keep in mind the national security concerns pertaining to space. And we've touched on that with defense and cyber and the actors. But as space activities, we're really bounded by this fragile international legal framework and the advent of these new entrants into space and these technologies. So this is something that needs to be addressed, I think, with, well, I've just got some construction work up. I'm in the office, I apologize. But I'm going to say, yes, walk, crawl, run. We've got the next 3 to 5 years to really get this fragile ecosystem correct, or we risk not only losing out on the opportunity of new space, but out competing each other. And without a national complementing position of where Australia wants to be, we're at a risk of loss.
Okay, and Andy, from the CRC's perspective, your outlook for the next 3 years and your key focus areas. I think from an audience perspective, getting a sense of where the SmartSat CRC is going as well.
We are quite enthusiastic and excited about the future. The outlook for not only for SmartSat but for the whole space industry is really very, very good in the next few years. We should seize the opportunities of AUKUS, Quad, and the civil side of the opportunities that are coming to us. I think Todd is right about Australia being an attractive place, and therefore we should really leverage that. I think as Australians, though, we should also really understand and accept that failure is really a critical feature of success. And therefore we need to, and governments in particular, need to support not only the R&D environment, and we are very happy about that, but also the next stages, the productization and the commercialization of the technology so that we can have viable companies that can eventually become global companies.
And Todd, from Inmarsat and the sort of satellite sector that you deal with as well, how does the next 3 years look for you? And then obviously your operations here in Australia, what would be some of the key programs and projects that you would expect to come to fruition?
Thanks, Chris. So first of all, I just want to pick up on something Andy said because I love it, right? So in fact, I'd take it a step further. Fail faster. So what you want to do is try it. No, it didn't work. Chuck it away. Right. Pick up the next one. Right. So that's what we want. Fail faster. Because, I remember Steve Jobs saying once, they work on 1,000 things and work out which 997 to throw away and keep 3. And so that's sort of what you want to do if you want to go, want to pick things up. And, I tend to think of these things as what I call it an opportunity flywheel. So if you want to go through crawl, walk, run quicker, you want to suck things in, do the fail faster thing, and then try the next thing, and you will speed things up. And I think there's quite a lot of opportunity here. The SBAS program with Geoscience Australia, we see that as a get started for what's possible in PNT elsewhere. We have a number of other programs running already, which are leveraging new infrastructure, putting east and west coast of Australia at the moment. And so we see that as exporting Australia to the world, sometimes bringing some of the world back into Australia, but certainly across comms, positioning, and also a bit of inter-satellite connectivity. So some other technology we've developed now that allows LEOs to communicate with GEOs, so you can shoot information off a small sat onto a big sat and not have to look for a gateway.
Right.
So all of those areas are very right now things which will cause this flywheels, because you want to get it into the right now, and that will grow and become bigger. And that is what will pull the industry along. That will drive things up, and that will definitely generate investment in Australia in skills, people, money, everything.
And Malcolm, I wanted to finish off with you in terms of that strategic outlook for the next 3 years. And are we going fast enough, as Todd and Andy sort of say, in terms of fail faster and prepare to fail? We're a slightly risk-averse nation in many respects. Your outlook for the next 3 years with those thoughts in mind.
Well, look, I think let's start with AUKUS. AUKUS gives us a huge opportunity to accelerate things, to try new opportunities in terms of what we can do in space and how we can support our key partners. That approach needs to be extended to the Quad and the Quad Plus. So let's actually build some really strong multilateral frameworks whereby Australia can focus on. Second point would be a national space strategy. That needs to be a priority for the next government, so that we can have some sort of overarching strategic vision of where we want to be as a country and how we get there. And that way we can align in resources and capabilities and expertise more effectively. And the third point is, we are existing from a defence analyst perspective, we are existing in a much more adverse and contested strategic environment. The risks of crises emerging are much higher now than what they were 5 years ago. So I think we do need to be prepared to respond quickly and agilely to change in our circumstances, rather than drift on autopilot with big projects. Keep those going, but have a second parallel path that allows us to respond quickly to sudden change or sudden disruption. And that could be in space, it could be cyber, it could be other areas. But we do need to embrace the fail fast approach. We can't afford to maintain the mindset of, well, let's have a 10-year or a 20-year acquisition cycle. That's passé, that's gone. We can't afford to have that any longer. So that would be my perspective.
Yeah, and you mentioned contestation. I think it's that competition Australia needs to be aware of, even between our own allies for skills and for advanced technology. So it's definitely one to be watching out for. Look, it's a big topic, and I like the way Malcolm sort of wrapped that up in terms of around our key sort of defence partnerships, the Quad and the AUKUS, the national space strategy. If anything, there's an outcome from this particular session when we looked at national space capability. We don't really have a national space strategy, and therefore we're not quite sure where we are heading or where the direction is just yet. And then we need to be aware of, and it's not just our sort of adversaries, it's also our climate and the environment that we also need to be aware of is also changing. So, and space obviously has a direct link back to that on those capabilities. So look, thank you so much. There's no more questions from the audience, and we've gone for the full hour. I'd like to thank our panelists, and if I may just bring them back up on screen 1 second. And that should have worked there. So let me thank our panelists, and also our sponsor representative today with Inmarsat, Todd McDonell, President with Global Government with Inmarsat. Thank you very much, Todd, there. And Dr. Malcolm Davis in Canberra, Senior Analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Andy Koronios, CEO with SmartSat CRC, and Dr. Catherine Grace, Assistant Director, South Australian Space Industry Centre. Very much enjoyed that discussion, and a great way to start off the ASITI Festival of Space and our series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.